Godwyn the Golden, the poor victim of an unfortunate crime, a crime that marked the beginning of the end for the age of the Erd Tree. For when the moon touches the sun, destined death shall be warded away, and the soulless bones will be given life to bring about the dawn of a new age. But now, the only thing left of his legacy is a half-dead corpse hidden beneath the earth, and the most pitiful man to hold the title of the Golden.
Honestly, Godric's nothing more than a jumped-up country bumpkin. Lord? Oh, don't make me laugh. And to think, he's the blood of Godfrey, last of the Golden lineage, though you almost wouldn't know it to look at him.
Slug, craven, runt, ugly, and weasel are all words to describe Godric the Golden, yet none would call him Lord. The first demigod most players will face in their journey to reach the Elden Ring is one of the most loathsome, and also the most tragic. Hated and despised, and seen as nothing more than a pretender grasping for the throne of Elden Lord, and eclipsed by the other demigods, Godric might actually have the most legitimate claim as the true heir of all that is golden. But how did the Golden lineage become tarnished? How did the last heir to the first Elden Lord end up so low? When is the eclipse supposed to bring Godwyn back? And why did it all start with Radagon and the ancient dragons? To answer that question, we have to go back. Back through the long-faded Sun Realm and to the beginning of life itself, to learn how Godric is a true-born heir, and why Godwyn is the bastard of the Golden lineage. In a story co-written by the legendary author George R. R. Martin, at least one royal child needed to be a bastard. By the end of this video, I'm gonna blow your damn mind. It's time to bring out the sun. Without order, nothing can exist. Without chaos, nothing can evolve. It is said that long ago, the Greater Will sent a golden star bearing a beast into the lands between, which would later become the Elden Ring. It was the vassal beast of the Greater Will, and living incarnation of the concept of order. Before the Elden Beast's arrival to the lands between, we can assume that without order, nothing existed in a way that we could understand it. There was no life. There was no death. No hot, no cold, no up, and no down. The first beings to gain life were the rocks and stones, the great and mighty ancient dragons. Much of what we know about the ancient dragons comes from the multi-generational history we can find throughout Farum Azula. Found embedded in the ground of the city in the sky, the great ancient dragons can be seen, their scales comprised of gold-tinged stones which are thought to be the source of their immortality. The ancient dragons wielded red lightning bolts, their red tint exemplifying the nature of primordial gold, which was said to be close in nature to life itself. Their leader and their king was the dragon lord Placidusax, whose stone scales could twist time, his seat lying at the heart of the storm beyond time. Placidusax was the Elden Lord, ruling during the prehistoric era before the Erd Tree, and the ancient dragons would protect their lord as a wall of living rock. During his reign, we can assume that the world was unchanging, and that order was set in stone, unaltered for millennia. Thanks to the excellent work done by Zuli the Witch, we know that Placidusax's two heads are denoted as one being male and the other being female, embodying a similar aspect of Marika and Radagon. One body, two minds, Elden Lord and Empyrean combined together in a body akin to stone, a body that could be the vessel and the vision for the Elden Ring. That is all to say that Placidusax's god who fled was none other than the Elden Beast, stored inside Placidusax's body of stone as its vessel, much like we find it housed in the body of Marika and Radagon, the Elden Ring and its order being one literally set in stone. Once Placidusax's god fled, the Lord continued to await its return. This was the beginning of organic life in the lands between. This was the beginning of the great tree roots and the spreading of runes throughout the lands between. The Lord of rock and stone would await the return of its god, a return to the order of the ancient, and beasts would rise throughout the lands. In the deep root depths, we find the beginning of the great tree roots and the source of the Ainzel and Safra rivers. These two main rivers travel the entire length of the lands between, and we can assume that the runes from the Elden Ring were able to travel down it as well. spreading a modicum of its power to the flora and fauna and allowing for life to evolve. We would see a similar evolutionary history to our world, the ancient dragons locked in stone, unaware of the time that's passed, while new life began to flourish, that of fur, tail, scale, and feather. Prehistory would not end until history could be recorded, and for that, the beasts of the lands between needed to be gifted with intelligence. When the beasts first gained intelligence, stones became their weapons. But as their wildness slipped away and civilization took hold, the beasts began to develop more complex weapons of war. They would use fire and clay to craft earthenware jars for the express purpose of making shields. They would develop burial rituals and entomb their dead in stone, accompanied by ornamentation of jewels and gold. Perhaps the beastmen found the stone bodies of the ancient dragons within the earth, and the abundance of gold that graced their stone scales granted them intelligence, the power of runes transferring from the slumbering ancients to the beasts of the lands between. Thus, the ancient dragons would seem as gods to the early beastmen, and they would mimic their gods with their stone burials and rock weapons. Eventually, they would forge iron weapons in such a way that they could make heavy yet well-balanced blades, making it clear that these beastmen possess knowledge beyond humankind of the present. Alongside their expert craftsmanship of iron and stone, their ornate and complex burial rituals, they would also develop religious beliefs and practices. Their high-ranking clergymen, such as Geraint, would be giving chinquedeas with a design that celebrated the beast's 5 fingers, the symbol of the intelligence gifted upon their kind. Beastmen clerics with white fur could be found reciting incantations in order to cast the red lightning of the ancient dragons. With their intelligence expanded, they could learn the ways of the stone ancients. Or perhaps, much like Lanciax took human form to commune with the Leyndell Knights, an ancient dragon was hidden amongst the beastmen to spread its knowledge and convert the beastmen into devotees and zealots. Regardless of how it happened, chosen beastmen would have their weapons clad in lightning to defend the remains of the giant mausoleum enshrining an ancient dragon, and statues could be found showing beastmen and dragons together. It isn't known if the beastmen and the ancient dragons coexisted at the same time, or if the beastmen just discovered the remains of an ancient dragon embedded in the earth, but what is certain is that the beastmen revered them as gods. Eventually, the rule of beastmen would subside, and man would become the dominant force. The first civilization of man most likely began with the ancient dynasty, before they were buried underground, and whose civilization flourished before the Erd Tree. At some point, this civilization would discover the Great Tree roots, and possibly even cultivate the Erd Tree or multiple Erd Trees. Whatever happened during the ancient dynasty, civilization would continue to advance, time would move forwards, and we would see man take over the city of Farum Azula. By inspecting the reliefs and statues, we see what looks like a royal family, with a kingly man, a woman, and a child. Later, we find a young woman accompanied by 3 wolves beneath the relief of an ancient Elden Ring, with many runes and rings and a spiral down its center. The unity between man and beast, all under the guidance of order, under the Elden Ring. I assume that the 2 people in this painting are that royal family, the kingly man seated and his wife with child. That child eventually growing into this young woman, who is most likely Marika. We can't say for certain, but by process of elimination, Marika seems like the most likely pick for this statue. From here, I think we see the full history of this city. At one point, it was a mausoleum constructed by the Beastmen to enshrine an ancient dragon and eventually came under the control of some powerful men, through violence or other means. These men would then claim royalty to validate their control and legitimacy. Perhaps they were Numens. Perhaps they were just humans. Perhaps there was something else entirely. When arriving at Farum Azula, you may have noticed something unique to the area. No matter what time of day, the sun is always setting. You will never see a star or the moon from the ancient city in the sky. And with the ruin fragments found throughout the world, we know that the stones of this city glow with a faint light from within. We also find beastmen who live in death carrying the most important item for understanding the recent history of the lands between. The Sun Realm Shield, a shield of honor depicting a city crowned by the sun. It has seen better days. Much like the wear upon the shield, the seat of the sun is long faded away. The age of the sun, and the first golden order, the last age before the age of the Erd Tree. This is probably the first time you heard about the age of the sun or the first golden order. and I bet you want to know how this all ties in with Godwyn and Godric. I promise that by the end of this history lesson, you'll be asking if I got an early copy of Shadow of the Erdtree. Don't tell anybody. Before we continue, we need to make it clear that the Golden Order is not the first order to have existed in the Lands Between. We know that the Elden Ring is malleable, and that runes can be added or removed from it, as exemplified by the removal of Destined Death, the removal of the Great Runes, and how newly created Mending Runes can be added. With the Beastmen having religious beliefs that included burial practices, we can safely assume that death was as natural as life within the Lands Between at some point. Even throughout Far Missoula, we find reliefs of the Twin Bird, who is said to be the mother of the Death Birds and the envoy of an outer god. Being the mother of the Death Birds, I think we can safely deduce that their outer god was the outer god of death. The Golden Order was created when the Rune of Death, also known as Destined Death, was removed from the Elden Ring. As we see presently in the Lands Between, the removal of the Rune of Death has led to undeath, and without Erdtree burial, the mad undead wander aimlessly as a product of their unending life. During the Age of the Sun, this wasn't a problem, for when there was no Erdtree, death was burned in ghost flame. Vengeful spirits would rise from these flames, but the Death Birds were the graveyard firekeepers and would rake out the cinders and ashen remains from their kilns. Priests during this time were permitted to come among the Death Birds and act as their guardians. This oath sworn through the rite of death also served as a promise for their distant resurrection. We see something similar with the minor Erdtree guardians, who in accordance with an ancient pact with the Erdtree, were not destroyed with their deaths, but instead were granted a renewed eternal life as guardians of the Erdtree. It seems no matter what age, whoever controls death controls the Lands Between. So although death was removed from the Elden Ring, the Age of the Sun still had means to deal with eternal life without the need of Erdtree burial. You still may not be convinced that the Sun Realm, or even the Age of the Sun, existed or is even relevant. In fact, I've seen some people suggest that the Sun Realm shield is just a cute reference to Dark Souls, but I assure you, the Sun Realm did exist, and it was the first and true Golden Order. But don't take my word for it. We can look towards the reigning expert on Golden Order fundamentalism, the ever-brilliant Goldmask. Religious fundamentalists uphold a literal and strict interpretation of their scripture and beliefs. So we can trust that characters like the Goldmask, or Radagon, have an accurate and fundamental understanding of the Golden Order. Fixed to his face is a radiant gold mask, created and designed by the Lord Goldmask himself to resemble a blazing golden halo. Its striking design represents the brilliant inspiration that once shone upon him, and the vision of a ring that he will surely find at the end of his pursuit. In the wise words of Solaire of Astora,
"If you miss it, you must be blind."
the Goldmask is wearing the sun right on his face. Golden Order fundamentalist incantations, such as Triple Rings of Light or Discus of Light, also evoke the sun as a ring of light that fires forward and returns back to its position, much like the sun sets in the evening only to rise again in the morning. The discus of light that flies through the sky will eventually disappear, but it will always return. Though the Goldmask does wear bracelets and wrist wraps made in the image of Erdtree branches, he did not make these adornments himself. These were all made by his disciples who long since left him. Perhaps they were like Corrin, staying blind from the truth, and couldn't see the sun clearly affixed to his face. We also have the Mending Runes, which if you look very closely, you could see each of them are in the shape of the sun. Goldmask's rune is like a perfect golden sun. Fia's rune, a sun in eclipse, the moon blocking out its golden light. And not only does Dung Eater wear a large sun medallion around his neck, but his rune appears as a sun made of omen horns. Items like the Warming Stone even compare the Erdtree to the power of the sun, when it was as warm as the gentle sun and would heal all who bathed in its rays. I think we can clearly pinpoint that before the age of the Erdtree, we had an age of the sun, and it seems that many of our characters are looking for a revival of the Sun Realm, in some way at least. Whether it's just in the power that the sun had via the Elden Ring, or if it's an actual political revival of the previous ruling power. This comes with a lot of implications. Particularly, what does this mean for Golden Order fundamentalists like Radagon, and for a time, his son Mikola? If Radagon is an adherent of the Sun, or the true Golden Order, did he want to burn the Erd Tree down with Marika? That question will have to wait for another time. Let me know down in the comments if you're interested in my thoughts on Radagon and where his motivations might lie. But right now, we're here to talk about Godwyn, Godric, and the Ancient Dragons. So how does the Sun Realm connect to dragons? Well, not only is Farum Azula the apparent dragon capital of the Lands Between, but by looking at the Sun Realm shield, we can see the full story. On the face of the shield, we see the seat of the sun, and a Norman-style castle crowned by a blazing halo. This style of castle is seen in such places as Fort Height, Fort Feroth, Fort Gale, Caria Manor, Castle Morn, Castle Redmane, the Guardian's Garrison, Stormvale Castle, the fortified manor in Leyendell, and the most apparent one, Castle Sol, Castle of the Sun. In nearly every one of these castles, you can find the armaments of the banished knights and exiled soldiers, and even the knights and soldiers themselves. Their swords and shields strewn about on tables, or strung up on the walls. Weaponry such as fire cannons with the heads of dragons affixed to their fronts can also be found. The banished knights were fierce warriors and all accomplished, and despite their territorial losses at the end of the Sun Realm's reign, they were still named knights. Their helms can be found with the ornamentation of dragons on the crown, or horns evoking dragons on their shoulders. Some banished knights seem to have switched sides, and we can find their armor gilded gold within the royal capital. In the Fringelands, where many of these old Sun Realm forts can be found, dragon communion churches are also located. In Limgrave, there is a dragon communion church, but with the fall of the Sun Realm, it seems that the statues of ancient dragons have been defaced and destroyed. The nearby Fringe Folk Hero's Grave has also been converted into an Erd Tree burial site, but the ghosts of exiled soldiers and banished knights can still be found, their ashes unreturned to Erd Tree roots. One of them even carries a dragon communion seal, indicating their full devotion to the path of the dragon. In the Caelid Wilds, where another share of the Sun Realm forts can be found, is a Dragon Communion church guarded by 2 banished knights who can cast Dragon Communion spells such as Fire Breath. The banished knights also have ties to the Storm, with nearly all of them being able to cast storm spells in battle, evoking the power of the Stormhawks of Stormvale, Placidusax and his Stormcloud, and the storm that used to rage in that land. And to wrap it all up in a nice bow, banished knights and Stormhawks can both be found within Farum Azula, as well as the undead beastmen carrying the shield of the Sun Realm. But let's ignore the Erd Tree invaders for now. So within all of these Sun Realm era castles and forts, we find the weaponry of banished knights from a long-vanished nation who either wear dragon ornamentation on their armor, cast dragon communion spells, or cast Stormvale spells, connecting these knights and these places to the Sun Realm, dragon worship, and the storm. For a time, it seemed that all lived under the warmth of the sun, whether beast, bird, or man. But that was then, and now is the age of the Erd Tree. In the beginning, everything was against the Erd Tree, and it was born amongst conflict. This would make sense, since the light pollution from the Erd Tree nearly drowns out the sun completely, making it difficult to see the blazing discus of light even at high noon. And just by looking at Erd Tree burial, it doesn't seem like a pleasant process. The Erd Tree requires a constant supply of fresh bodies and soul to maintain its health and allow it to produce its invigorating sap. But I think you can imagine on your own how some people might not be too keen on that idea. Just by using our eyes and looking at Erd Tree burial, I don't know what's worse, being burned in cold ghost flame or being eaten by a tree. That's a value judgment for you to make. This is most likely where the Shaded Castle got its name. What was once a castle that bathed in the sun's rays was now put in the shade by the Erd Tree. The Shaded Castle is occupied by depraved perfumers who wear snakes on their aprons, the snake being the betrayer of the Erd Tree. And this place also houses the Wraith Callers and Royal Revenants, beings who are harmed by Erd Tree healing incantations. It looks like House Marai was harboring enemies of the tree that put their castle in the shade. So now that we got all of that out of the way, what does this have to do with Godric and Godwyn? If you can, pause the video and try to look for evidence for who the father of each demigod is. When you unpause, I'll tell you what I think is the best evidence for proving each demigod's daddy. Don't worry, we'll wait. And welcome back. From Enya, We know that great runes are the stuff of demigods, all descendants of Queen Marika. So without a doubt, all of these characters share a bloodline with Marika, regardless if it's because she is their mother or she is their father, as Radagon, or if they are a descendant far down the royal line. Without a doubt, these characters are all the blood of Queen Marika. As a disclaimer, the game uses the title of demigod in two ways. One is either direct descendants of Marika, and the other is just a title meaning you're a part of the royal godly family. This can be confusing, so we just have to use our intuition to determine how the word is being used in the context given. We'll start with Godric's Great Rune, which reads, "The first demigods were the Elden Lord Godfrey and his offspring, the Golden Lineage. Unfortunately, this item doesn't say anything specifically about Godric's parentage, just what the criteria is to be part of the Golden Lineage, which is being the offspring of Godfrey and Marika." Radahn and Rykard's Great Runes both similarly read that they were amongst the children of Rennala and Radagon, who became demigod stepchildren after Radagon's union with Queen Marika, and they're both similarly shaped. Since we know that Radagon is Marika, the Carian children were always demigods. Unfortunately, Ranni doesn't have a Great Rune for us to read. However, we have dialogue from Roger.
Lunar Princess Ranni, one of the children born to King Consort Radagon and his first wife, Rennala, demigod and sister to General Radahn and Praetor Rykard.
We can consider Roger a mostly accurate source because of his claims that he wished to become a scholar and spent much of his time scouring the archives for knowledge. Malenia's Great Rune reads that she is the daughter of Queen Marika and Radagon, and her Great Rune should have been the most sacred of all. Miquella's Great Rune unfortunately doesn't state his parentage. If you're confused by that line, the answer will be revealed in part 2 of this video series. But we know he is the twin brother to Malenia, so he must have the same parents. There are also items such as Radagon's Rings of Light, which reads, "A gift of gratitude to the young Miquella from his father, Radagon." Morgott's Great Rune tells us that his Great Rune is the Anchor Rune that houses the base and proves two things: that the Omen King was born of the Golden Lineage, and that he was indeed the Lord of Leyndell. And Mohg's Great Rune reads, "Mohg and Morgott are twin brothers, and their Great Runes are naturally similar." Much like Radahn and Rykard, the Omen brothers' Great Runes are similar in shape, and their Great Runes prove that they were born of the Golden Lineage. Based on the criteria set by Godric's Great Rune, we can confirm that Morgott and Mohg are the direct sons of Godfrey and Marika, and Morgott's Great Rune makes it very explicit that him and his twin brother are born of the Golden Lineage. For Godwyn, it gets even less clear. As of right now, we have no direct evidence to who his father is, but the pieces of evidence we can point to are his title, Godwyn the Golden, and dialogue from the finger reader crone in the Deeproot Depths.
Lord Godwyn, oh, my poor sweet lordling should have died a true death. A scion of the Golden Bough, sentenced to live in death. How could such a thing come to be?
Most people I have seen point to the final line, a scion of the Golden Bough, to mean that Godwyn is part of the Golden Lineage. But if we break down the phrase literally, we don't get that. A scion has two meanings. It can either mean a descendant from a notable family, or a twig of a plant, especially one cut for grafting or rooting, while bough is defined as the main branch of a tree. With that, we could read the line literally as the descendant of a notable family that has been cut from the main branch of a tree, or has been cut to graft to the main branch of the tree. This does not confirm any relation to the Golden Lineage. All it does confirm is the relation to the Erd Tree and the royalty derived from it. Although Godfrey was the Elden Lord who brought about the age of the Erd Tree, it is Marika who is almost intimately connected to the Erd Tree. For even after Godfrey's banishment, the relation of the Erd Tree stays with Marika and doesn't leave with him. While many of her statues portray as what we know to truly represent her crucifixion within the Erd Tree, a regular person who lived within the Lands Between could see this pose evoking the imagery of a tree and its branches. Items like Erd Tree's favor depict Marika as personally bestowing Erd Tree blessings upon their recipients. These blessings most likely being the sacred tears found at the churches of Marika. We also have the weapon that Godfrey is associated with, an axe, which next to fire, is probably a tree's greatest enemy. This ties into something very interesting, that the only demigods to be explicitly classified as Godfrey's children are crucible-afflicted omens who are hidden away underground in shame. Godfrey also led the Crucible Knights, so due to his close proximity to all things Crucible, it makes sense as to why he would have omen children. It now looks like a very deliberate choice that the game directly clarifies Morgott and Mohg's parentage, but not Godwyn. But if Godwyn isn't the son of Godfrey, what does that change about his character? And how does that affect his motivations and story? So, we have the history of the ancient dragons, the Beastmen, the Sun Realm and the Age of the Sun, and no definitive proof of Godwyn or Godric's paternal heritage. But how does this all tie together? What does all of this have to do with the eclipse? Would you believe me if I said this was connected to the Night of the Black Knives, the revival of the Sun Realm, and the end to the Erd Tree? First, this is what we know with absolute certainty about Godwyn before he becomes the Prince of Death. His name is Godwyn the Golden. He fought in the war against the ancient dragons. He befriended the ancient dragon Fortisax, the events that ended the war against the ancient dragons and gave rise to the ancient dragon cult in the capital. And it is said that golden lightning was wielded by Godwyn. With what I presented to you so far, doesn't this all look a little suspicious? Now that we know the history of the lands between before the Erd Tree, of the reign of the ancient dragons and the dragon-aligned Sun Realm, it seems that the friends Godwyn may have had may not have been too keen with this Erd Tree. And when it comes to Godwyn's title, the Golden, what is it referring to? Is it his hair? His golden lightning? Being the Golden Child? The Golden Order of the Sun? The Golden Order of the Erd Tree? Being part of the Golden Lineage? There are too many variables for us to say for certain, but we should doubt that his name comes from being part of the Golden Lineage based on all other things that are golden, including the sun, his lightning, and the Erd Tree. From the Death Lightning spell, it is said that golden lightning was wielded by Godwyn. And when I think golden lightning bolts in Dragon Wars, I think of the Lord of Sunlight himself, Gwyn from Dark Souls. The parallels between the two are a bit too on the nose for it to be a coincidence, especially since Hidetaka Miyazaki directed both games, so we must consider the comparison. Their names are nearly the same, Gwyn and Godwyn. They both fought in a war against ancient dragons made of stone, and they both wielded bolts of lightning. Gwyn was the Lord of Sunlight, and from what we learned from the Golden Order fundamentalists, the original Golden Order was an Age of the Sun. We put all of this together, and I think we have Godwyn the Golden having a closer connection to the Sun and the Sun Realm than the Age of the Erd Tree. To clarify, this isn't to say he has zero relation to the Erd Tree, just that his interests may not be aligned with preserving the Age of the Erd Tree. The war against the ancient dragons is also a curious event. The ancient dragons ruled the lands between in the prehistoric era, for perhaps eons before the Erd Tree. But after invading the Erd Tree's capital and killing who knows how many people, they decided that after befriending one demigod that it was enough for them to say, "Nah, you guys got a good thing going on. We don't want to rule anything anymore. You got it all under control." We should be questioning the motivations of the ancient dragons and be very suspicious to why they would accept defeat and partnership with the warriors of the Erd Tree. We know that ancient dragons like Lanciax transformed into human priestesses to commune with the knights of the capital and created the ancient dragon cult. The cult was seen as permissible under the order of the Erd Tree because the ancient dragon's scales were imbued with gold. And while golden lightning and golden scales were accepted, we know that ancient dragons wielded red lightning bolts, and that the ancient dragon prayer book, which contains those incantations, never reached the lands between. With the disdain for which the color red is held in Erd Tree culture, such as red hair of the fire giants, the red tint found in the Crucible Knight's weaponry, or the Leonian Misbegotten, the predominant leadership within Leyndell may not have accepted a dragon cult if they were aware of this red lightning. At the start of this video, I said that Placidusax was Elden Lord, but that wasn't entirely true. There is no direct line of text that firmly states that Placidusax was definitely an Elden Lord, but the remembrance reads, "They are said to have been Elden Lord in an age before the Erd Tree." With that, we should ask the question, who is saying this? What would someone gain for questioning the legitimacy of Godfrey, first Elden Lord? Based on the clues, I think we may be seeing a case where the ancient dragons decided their best way to defeat the Erd Tree would not be with brute force, but through subterfuge and deception. These are beings of rock and stone, and have existed since time immemorial. Days and years are alike to one who lives the life eternal, and a well-laid plan can be more powerful than military might. Befriend the most beloved demigod, and use him as a tool to convert the royal capital's standing army into dragon worshippers. Convince them early on that their beliefs were acceptable underneath the Erdtree due to the power of gold. Spread rumors that their Elden Lord is illegitimate in their claims, and the true Elden Lord is awaiting their return to power. All the while building up a plot for a potential dragon overthrow of the Erdtree royal family, and reinstate the ancient dragons and their allies as the ruling power of the Elden Ring like they were in the prehistoric era, like they were during the Sun Realm. Even now in Leyndell, we see this battle taking place, a battle of beliefs and ideas. The Erdtree bent to the side as a beacon purely for worship, the power of its dew and sap gone. But Grandsax still stands tall. His powerful gravel stone scales can still be harvested. The power of the ancient dragons persists even now behind these walls. If we wanted to compare to Dark Souls again, we learn in Dark Souls 3 that Gwyn's firstborn son was banished for befriending dragons. With that, we have a persistent theme that trust within ancient dragons can be seen as treacherous and dangerous for the current ruling power. There's also the giant, bug-eyed elephant, or fish, in the room, and that's Godwyn himself. His body doesn't look like a man's body. He looks like a giant fish, or as I would call him, a sea dragon. He has a fish tail with scales, and his hands have claws. He has a clamshell face and what looks like fins on his arms. While Godfrey's two confirmed sons are omens with horns and tails, they still have more human characteristics than Godwyn does. So why does Godwyn look like this? Is this a byproduct of experiencing a soul death? Do we have any indication that this is directly connected to the rune of death contorting his body in such a way? When we find Ranni's body, she still looks like a humanoid. Although she experienced the other half of the rune of death, why doesn't her body contort and shift like Godwyn's has? We know that ancient dragons can take the form of humans, and Godwyn looks like a half-man, half-sea dragon hybrid. I think we're seeing Godwyn's true form here, and that without his soul, his body cannot maintain his typical human appearance. Even in the story trailer, we get a direct shot of Godwyn's eye, and it looks a bit reptilian. Not as drastic as partaking in dragon communion, but still not like your typical eye as you would expect to see on a man. That is all to say that just from looking at the guy, what do you see more of? A man or a dragon? So perhaps Godwyn is part dragon. Why would that matter, and what does it have to do with the Sun Realm or even the Eclipse? We still have a few more connections to make. And first we're going to look at the dragon-worshipping banished knights who appear to be the loyal vanguards to the Sun Realm. In Castle Sol, the Castle of the Sun, we find many banished knights and exiled soldiers. We also find Commander Niall, whose signature move is his Storm Kick, where he infuses his leg blade in golden lightning. As we know from Death Lightning, golden lightning was wielded by Godwyn. Castle Sol also holds the Eclipse Hotel, and its weapon art Death Flare makes mention of the Prince of Death directly. There is no doubt that Castle Sol and the Eclipse have a connection to Godwyn. With what we learned about the Banished Knights and the Sun Realm, that connection is even stronger than ever. Before we used Miyazaki's previous game, Dark Souls, to help reinforce this theory, but Elden Ring's lore was co-written by the masterclass fantasy author George R. R. Martin, and we can look towards his work to see parallels to this theory. Spoilers ahead for A Song of Ice and Fire and the television show Game of Thrones. I'll be going over the parallels briefly, but if you're interested in more comparisons between Elden Ring and A Song of Ice and Fire, please let me know in the comments. Westeros was ruled by the Targaryen royal family for roughly 300 years after they conquered the continent with the use of their dragons. The House of the Dragon was eventually overthrown in a rebellion led by Robert Baratheon, and he becomes king. There's a line from the book A Clash of Kings about Robert Baratheon that really evokes Godfrey. It reads, "I tell you this, Robert was never the same after he put on that crown. Some men are like swords, made for fighting. Hang them up, and they go to rust." Where Godfrey takes the beast regent Sirash on his back to suppress his bloodlust, Robert Baratheon marries Cersei Lannister, of House Lannister, whose family sigil is that of a golden lion. They would have 3 children together, and all 3 would have the blonde hair of the Lannisters, where Baratheon children should have hair as black as night. Turns out, all of Robert Baratheon's bastard-born children have black hair, and the blonde children that Cersei Lannister bore were actually conceived between her and her twin brother Jaime Lannister. There are even some theories that make the case that Cersei and Jaime are actually Targaryen bastards themselves, so their children would actually have a legitimate claim to the Iron Throne, being bastard heirs born of the Targaryen line. With all of that, who do you think Godwyn's father could be? Which dragon did Marika have a child with? Herself, obviously. The following theory is definitely heavy speculation, but the evidence is in-game and can't be ignored. Although out of scope for this video, I would recommend familiarizing yourself with the Radagon is a mimic theory. Lore theorists such as Kite Tales, Elden Tales, and Cosmos all have really great videos on the subject, and you can find the links in the description of this video. To be brief, let's say that Radagon is a silver tier mimic of Marika. The silver tier makes mockery of life, reborn again and again into imitation. Perhaps one day, it will be reborn a lord. And from the juvenile scholar robes, we learn that yet their rebirth is not without perfections, and thus do they repeat the process, eventually becoming utterly dependent on it. Rebirth is as sleep to them, and with each awakening, memory fades into oblivion. If Radagon is a mimic, reborn again and again into imitation, whose memories could fade into oblivion with each rebirth, how does that make him the dragon who possibly fathered Godwyn? Well, mimics can be anything they choose to be. Perhaps, at one time before Radagon was a champion with red hair, he was something else, something more. Found in the consecrated snowfield, past a statue of the hooded Radagon and the magma worm Theodorix, is the locked cave of the Forlorn, where we can fight a Leonian misbegotten crusader who carries Radagon's golden ordered greatsword, and by the site of grace is a dragon embedded in the ice. Radagon's name is also an anagram for a dragon. An anagram is when you rearrange the letters of a word or phrase to make a new word or phrase. A good example would be in Harry Potter, where if you rearrange the name Tom Marvolo Riddle, you get I am Lord Voldemort. And found in the Altus Plateau, before the fight with the ancient dragon Lanciax, before the sword monument dedicated to the War of the Ancient Dragons, is the Stormcaller Church. Inside is the incantation Dragon Bolt Blessing. Only those loved by dragons can survive the ordeal of cladding their bodies in lightning. And above where you can find a sacred tier is a statue of none other than Radagon himself. A dragon indeed. And if all of that is true, then that would mean that Godwyn and Godric are not only not part of the Golden lineage, but perhaps have the most legitimate claim to the Elden Throne and status of Elden Lord, descendants of both Radagon and Marika, and blood of the dragon, a true-born heir. If only poor Godric knew that while he was grafting the limbs of the Tarnished to be more like Elden Lord Godfrey, he could have just been himself, amongst the banished knights of the Sun Realm, in his ancestral home of Stormvale. If only poor Godric knew. We can't be certain who Godwyn's father is, but there is enough evidence to doubt that it's Godfrey. And with the friends Godwyn made after the war against the Ancient Dragons, there may be a case to be made that he may not be totally aligned with the Erd Tree and its followers. And now that we know the history of the Lands Between, and that there is a gap in our knowledge about the previous Golden Order, the allegiances and motivations of Godwyn the Golden are starting to look a little bit muddy. Nevertheless, let's return back to the line I said at the start of this video. For when the moon touches the sun, destined death shall be warded away, and the soulless bones will be given life to bring about the dawn of a new age. By combining what we know about the eclipsed sun, destined death, and what we learn at Castle Sol, I made up this prophecy to evoke what I think the fanbase is hoping from Shadow of the Erd Tree. An eclipse will occur, and Godwyn will be resurrected. But what if I told you this eclipse already happened? Remember what the finger reader crone in the Deeproot Depths said about Godwyn?
Oh, my poor sweet lordling should have died a true death. As the first of the demigods to die. As a martyr to destined death.
Godwyn is named as a martyr to destined death, and this implies that Godwyn was possibly aware of the Black Knives plot and a co-conspirator who willingly sacrificed himself for some cause. But something went horribly wrong. Lunar Princess Ranni and her brother Rykard conspired with a group of royal female Numen from the Eternal City who had close ties to Marika herself to steal the Rune of Death from Malekith and perform a destined death ritual on Godwyn the Golden. Ranni then performed some magical rite to imbue the Rune of Death into the god-slaying Black Blades, and bestowed them upon the Black Knife assassins. The goal was to carve the mark of the centipede into Godwyn as a full circle, killing his body and his soul. But Ranni the Witch interfered, and at the moment of Godwyn's death, she also performed the ritual on herself. This split the curse mark into 2 half-wheels, killing Godwyn's soul and slaying Ranni's flesh, giving neither of them a true death, and leaving Godwyn to live in death. In the intro slide, Godwyn could be seen surrounded by Black Knife assassins, his head and hair draped to the side, and his arms held above his head. This pose evokes another similar image, someone else who knew of their coming sacrifice and their coming resurrection, the central figure to the world's largest religion. The assassins attempt to escape from the capital after Godwyn's death, and the ringleader Electo's daughter, Tish, is killed trying to protect her mother. The Black Knife assassins scattered throughout the lands between, sitting and waiting, while their leader is imprisoned in an Everjail on the Moonlight Altar. Afterwards, Ranni's soul is stored in a doll, and Godwyn's body is buried beneath the capital in the deep-root depths. Then, after Godwyn's soulless body is fed to the great tree roots, the Rune of Death began to spread across the lands between, sprouting in the form of Deathroot. This gave rise to those who live in death. Soulless bones were given life, and from the ground came bandits and militiamen, executioner and hexers, but most importantly of all, gave rise to soldiers of the long-fated Sun Realm, to bring about the dawn of a new age, the revival of a new Sun Realm. The first recorded death of a demigod in all of history gave birth to the Prince of Death, and it became the catalyst to the shattering of the Elden Ring, and a tarnish taking the Elden Throne. Perhaps that tarnish would mend the fractured Elden Ring with a rune in the shape of the sun. Do you see it now? The eclipse? Ranni, representing the moon, interfered with the golden sun, Godwyn, protecting them both from destined death, protecting them both from dying true deaths. Godwyn would be reborn again as the Prince of Death, his rebirth ending the reign of the Erd Tree and bringing about a new age, the Martyr embedded in the roots, his head slumped to the side and his arms raised up above. But that leaves us with an unanswered question. What of Miquella? Didn't he want the eclipse to bring about Godwyn's resurrection, or to give him a true death? If you want that answer, you'll just have to wait for part 2. Or you can watch my previous video on this topic, The Eclipse, Miquella's Secret Crime. Hey everybody, Jack here. Thank you for watching the video all the way through. I tried to put as many theories as I possibly could in a reasonable amount of time. Many of these theories you could find in my previous videos that have a different style than most lore videos, specifically my 2 main videos that follow Miquella and what I think his plans are for our Tarnished as well as the lands between. You can watch either of those videos, The Eclipse, Miquella's Secret Crime, or its sequel video, A Game of Cardinal Sin, Miquella's Master Plan. There's also a Discord you can join. You can find that down in the description. As well in the description, you could find all of the videos that I referenced throughout this video. I hope you had a good time watching it. Hope maybe some of these theories convinced you of anything. I try to pull my knowledge of theorizing about Miyazaki's games for over a decade and theorizing about George R. R. Martin's writing for over a decade to, take that duality of authorship and try to present something that is new and unique and might not be something you have heard before. Please let me know down in the comments if anything I said maybe convinced you, especially, Godwyn as a dragon or the original Golden Order of being of the sun. The next video is going to be about the Great Runes, and it's also, I hope, to kind of lead up to what I think the timeline of Elden Ring looks like, and possibly what we'll be doing in the DLC. If you want to know that before that video comes out, then check out my master plan video. It's like nothing you've ever seen before when it comes to Elden Ring content. All right, thank you guys. Hope to see you in the next one.